Emily Carter had always believed in the kind of love that filled the pages of novels, the kind that transformed ordinary lives into extraordinary stories. When she met David Miller, she thought she had stepped into one of those very stories. Their beginning was nothing short of magic, the kind of whirlwind romance that friends envied and parents admired. They met at a college party in New York City, where Emily had been visiting a friend. She was holding a glass of red wine, laughing at a joke she didn't find particularly funny, when David appeared at her side. His confidence was magnetic, his smile disarming, his questions thoughtful in a way that felt rare. That first conversation lasted hours. They lost track of time as they moved from the crowded living room to the quiet balcony, talking about books, movies, ambitions, and fears. David confessed that he wanted to build a financial empire one day, while Emily admitted her dream of working in publishing, of nurturing stories that might change lives. He teased her about her idealism. She teased him about his arrogance. And by the end of the night, both felt something they couldn't quite name but didn't want to let go of. The weeks that followed were filled with long phone calls, late night coffees in Manhattan diners, and endless walks through Central Park. David had a way of making Emily feel like she was the only person who mattered. He showed up with flowers for no reason, left her little notes tucked into her books, and held her hand as though letting go wasn't an option. Emily, who had always been cautious with her heart, found herself surrendering piece by piece until she was hopelessly in love. 2 years later, under the glow of fairy lights on a snowy December evening, David proposed. Emily's yes was breathless, her cheeks wet with tears of joy. Their wedding was everything she had dreamed of, a candlelit ceremony in Brooklyn. Surrounded by family and friends, vows whispered with trembling voices and steady hearts. Emily believed with all of herself that this was forever. She believed love like theirs could weather any storm. In the beginning, marriage felt like an extension of that dream. Their Manhattan apartment was filled with laughter, the smell of home-cooked meals, and lazy Sundays spent in bed. Emily started her career in publishing, while David threw himself into finance with relentless ambition. Their nights often ended with wine and movies, their mornings with hurried kisses before work. Friends called them the golden couple, envied the way they seemed to fit so effortlessly together. Emily believed them. She believed they were untouchable. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. David started coming home later and later, brushing off her concerns with promises that it was temporary. Just a few months, he would say, kissing her forehead as he rushed out the door. Emily wanted to be patient, to support him the way a good wife should, but the months stretched into years. Dinner grew cold on the table. Conversations dwindled to monosyllables. The man who once wrote her love notes now buried himself in his phone, nodding absently as she tried to talk about her day. Emily fought to hold them together. She planned surprise dinners, bought tickets to plays they had once loved, suggested weekend trips to rekindle their spark. Each attempt was met with excuses. I've got a big client tomorrow. Next week, I promise. Or worse, why are you making such a big deal out of this? Her loneliness became unbearable. She poured herself into work, staying late at the office so she wouldn't have to come home to an empty apartment. At brunch, her friends noticed her distracted silences, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes. Are you okay, Em? They would ask gently. She always lied. We're just busy. It's normal. But at night, staring at the empty side of the bed, she felt like she was disappearing. The first real fight erupted one Saturday. Emily had spent hours cooking his favorite meal, lasagna with garlic bread and a bottle of red wine. She lit candles, set the table, and waited. When David finally came home, it was nearly midnight, and he smelled faintly of whiskey. You could have called, she said softly, trying to keep the hurt from her voice. I was with clients, he replied curtly, loosening his tie. Her hands trembled. Do clients always keep you out past midnight? He shot her a sharp look. What are you implying? I just feel like I don't exist to you anymore, she whispered. For a moment, she hoped he would soften, apologize, take her in his arms. Instead, he laughed bitterly. You knew who I was when you married me. I am not some guy who punches out at 5 and plays house. Tears blurred her vision. I didn't marry you for your job, David. I married you because I loved you. But you're not here anymore. He slammed his glass on the counter. Maybe I wouldn't work so hard if you weren't constantly nagging me. That night, she cried herself to sleep, facing the wall while he scrolled through emails beside her. The following weeks brought no relief. Emily began noticing changes she couldn't ignore. David guarded his phone like it was a lifeline, stepping into another room to take calls. He mentioned sudden business trips she hadn't heard about until the last minute. A new cologne lingered on his shirts, one she had never bought him. One evening, while doing laundry, she found a receipt in his jacket pocket from an expensive restaurant. The date matched a night he claimed to have been working late. Her chest tightened as she stared at it. She wanted to confront him, but fear held her back. What if he lied? What if he told her the truth? She slipped the receipt back into his pocket, her hands trembling. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling while David slept soundly beside her. Her thoughts spiraled, replaying every moment of distance, every excuse, every dismissive remark. The man she had married felt like a stranger. Another evening, while folding clothes in their bedroom, she saw his phone buzz on the dresser. A message preview lit up the screen. "Can't stop thinking about last night. Miss you already." Emily's blood turned cold. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. Before she could read more, David walked in, quickly grabbing the phone. He slipped it into his pocket, giving her a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just work," he said casually. Emily turned back to the laundry, her heart pounding. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. She folded his shirts with mechanical precision, her face a mask of calm, while inside, she crumbled. That night, when he fell asleep, she lay awake, staring at the shadows on the ceiling. Tears slid silently down her cheeks. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was a reality she couldn't unsee. She thought of their vows, of the promises whispered in front of everyone they loved. How easily they had shattered. In the bathroom mirror the next morning, she barely recognized herself. Her once bright eyes were dull, her cheeks hollow, her smile gone. She whispered to her reflection, "You can't keep living like this." Yet she stayed. Not out of weakness, but out of a stubborn, desperate hope that the man she loved was still buried beneath the lies. She told herself maybe it was just a mistake. Maybe he would realize what he was losing. But deep inside, something colder began to grow. It was more than sorrow now, more than loneliness. It was resolve, a quiet determination, sharp and unforgiving, waiting for its time. And though Emily didn't know it yet, the story of her marriage was no longer a love story. It was the beginning of something else entirely. Something darker, something that would one day demand a reckoning. The days that followed the discovery of David's betrayal felt like moving through a fog. Emily went through the motions of her daily life with mechanical detachment. She woke up, went to work, smiled politely at her colleagues, and came home to a man she no longer recognized. Every laugh he forced, every affectionate gesture felt like a dagger twisting in her chest. It was unbearable, and yet she remained silent. Silence, she realized, was a shield. David didn't suspect she knew. He carried on with his double life, making flimsy excuses and spinning careless lies. He underestimated her. He always had. To him, Emily was the dutiful wife, the quiet supporter who would never push too hard. But Emily had begun to change. Beneath her calm exterior, she was planning, observing, and storing every detail. Her pain had become fuel, hardening her heart into something unrecognizable, even to herself. At the publishing house where she worked, Emily found solace in the stories she edited. She buried herself in manuscripts about betrayal, redemption, and revenge. Every narrative sharpened her thoughts, giving her ideas she hadn't dared to consider before. She read about women who reinvented themselves, who turned their heartbreak into weapons, and with each story, Emily's resolve grew. It started subtly. She began keeping a journal, documenting every suspicious text, every unexplained absence, every receipt and inconsistency. She created a private email account where she forwarded digital traces of David's infidelity photos she found on social media, anonymous tips from her growing network of whispers. She wasn't reckless, she was meticulous. She knew she had to be patient, to gather enough evidence so that when the time came, there would be no escape for him. David, in his arrogance, didn't notice the shift. He still treated her like someone who would never leave, never fight back. When she smiled at him, he mistook it for forgiveness. When she stayed silent, he mistook it for weakness. In reality, Emily was building her own kind of empire, brick by brick, lie by lie. Her closest friend, Julia, noticed the subtle transformation. One evening, over glasses of wine in Emily's apartment, Julia asked carefully, "Are you okay? You seem different." Emily smiled faintly, twirling the stem of her glass. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady. But Julia wasn't convinced. "Fine doesn't look like this," Julia pressed. "You're quieter, harder, like you're carrying something heavy." Emily met her gaze and held it. For a moment, she considered confiding in her, unloading the truth she'd been holding on to like a poisonous secret, but then she thought better of it. Julia was kind, but kindness wasn't what Emily needed. What she needed was control, precision, and secrecy. "I'm just busy," Emily lied smoothly. "Work's been demanding." Julia let it go, but not without a worried look. Meanwhile, David became bolder. He stopped hiding the late nights, stopped pretending to be tired from work. He returned home with lipstick smudges that he tried to explain away as innocent hugs from clients. Emily nodded, pretending to believe him. But each lie only tightened the noose. He didn't know she was crafting around his neck. The turning point came one rainy evening when Emily followed him. She had rehearsed the moment for weeks, waiting for the perfect opportunity. When David announced that he had to meet a client in Midtown, she smiled sweetly, kissed his cheek, and wished him luck. Then she grabbed her coat and slipped out after him. From a safe distance, she watched him enter an upscale hotel, his umbrella shielding him from the rain. Her pulse pounded as she waited across the street, her hood pulled low. Minutes later, a woman appeared, tall, elegant, draped in a crimson coat. She greeted David with a kiss that was anything but professional. They disappeared inside together, laughing. Emily's hands shook as she snapped photos with her phone. Each click was a nail in the coffin of her marriage. She should have felt devastated, but instead, she felt something else: clarity. The truth was no longer abstract, no longer hidden in shadows. It was here, in front of her, undeniable and sharp. That night, when David returned home, smelling faintly of perfume, Emily played her role flawlessly. She asked about his meeting, nodded at his vague explanation, and even offered him tea. He smiled, oblivious, and she smiled back, though behind her eyes burned a storm he couldn't see. Weeks passed, and Emily's plan began to take shape. She consulted discreetly with a divorce attorney, posing as a hypothetical client. She learned about asset division, alimony, and the weight evidence could carry in court. The lawyer's words became ammunition, giving Emily insight into how she could not only leave David, but ruin him. Still, she wasn't ready. Not yet. She didn't just want freedom. She wanted justice. She wanted David to feel every ounce of the betrayal he had inflicted on her, to watch everything he had built crumble in his hands. She wanted him to suffer. Her chance came unexpectedly. At a charity gala hosted by one of David's wealthy clients, Emily attended by his side, dressed in a sleek black gown that turned heads. She played the perfect wife, smiling for cameras, laughing at jokes. And to anyone watching, they were still the golden couple. But Emily noticed the woman in the crimson coat across the room, watching David with possessive eyes. When David excused himself to take a call, Emily approached the woman with deliberate grace. "Beautiful event, isn't it?" she said smoothly. The woman, caught off guard, nodded. "Yes, very." Emily tilted her head, her smile polite but sharp. "I couldn't help but notice the way you were looking at my husband." Color drained from the woman's face. She stammered. I don't know what you mean." Emily leaned closer, her voice low and calm. "Don't worry, I'm not here to cause a scene. I just wanted you to know that I see you. And I know everything." The woman froze, her composure unraveling. Emily straightened, gave her a final smile, and walked away. It wasn't about intimidation, it was about planting fear, about letting her know that the game had shifted. That night, when David fell asleep, Emily stood by the window, staring out at the glittering city below. Her reflection in the glass was no longer that of a naive, broken woman. It was sharper, colder, and stronger. She realized then that revenge wasn't just about exposing him. It was about reclaiming herself, about rewriting the story he thought he controlled. The next morning, Emily began the second phase of her plan. She created anonymous accounts, sending the photos of David and his mistress to a select few of his colleagues. She crafted emails with precision, ensuring they appeared to come from unrelated sources. Rumors began to ripple through his professional circle, quiet whispers that grew louder with each passing day. David noticed the tension but couldn't trace its source. He came home irritable, snapping at Emily over trivial things. She endured it silently, hiding her satisfaction as she watched. His confidence wavered. One evening, after another tense dinner, David finally erupted. "Why does it feel like everyone's against me lately? Clients pulling back, colleagues avoiding me. What the hell is going on?" Emily feigned innocence, her brows furrowing. "I don't know, David. Maybe they're just busy," he grunted, frustrated, and poured himself another drink. Emily hid her smile behind her glass of water. Piece by piece, his empire was beginning to fracture, and Emily knew it was only the beginning. Emily's patience had transformed into a quiet, deadly precision. Each morning she rose with purpose, her mind buzzing with the intricate details of her plan. She had learned to move through her home like a shadow, collecting evidence, observing David's habits, cataloging every indiscretion. Her world had narrowed down to two things: her survival and her revenge. Nothing else mattered. David, meanwhile, remained oblivious to the storm brewing quietly around him. He continued to flaunt his arrogance, walking through his apartment as if he were still untouchable, still untarnished. He didn't notice how Emily's gaze lingered on his every action, measuring, weighing, and storing each slight, each lie, each betrayal. To him, she was still the dutiful wife, the woman who would tolerate his negligence, his infidelity, his arrogance. Emily had begun to master her emotions. Outwardly, she was calm, almost detached, her expressions perfectly neutral. But beneath that surface, her mind was a relentless machine, planning steps that would ensure David could never hurt her again. She was no longer the naive woman who had cried herself to sleep. She had become something sharper, more dangerous, and utterly deliberate. One afternoon, she decided it was time to expand her reach. Using the information she had collected, she began sending anonymous tips to the media outlets that reported on corporate scandals. Each email was meticulously crafted, planting seeds of suspicion about David's dealings without revealing her identity. She watched from a distance as small ripples began to form. Whispers among colleagues, a subtle shift in the way clients approached him. She smiled quietly to herself. Every step of her plan was working, even without confrontation. At home, she kept up the pretense of normalcy. She cooked meals, set the table, and asked about his day, never letting slip a hint of her duplicity. David, unknowing, continued to brag about minor victories at work, about new clients he had acquired. Unaware that the very foundation of his reputation was beginning to crumble, Emily's interactions with others had also changed. She no longer sought solace from friends. She needed no one. She became self-sufficient, relying only on herself to execute the plan she had meticulously devised. Her confidence radiated in subtle ways, an extra flicker of her eyes, a calmness in her voice, a steadiness in her movements that made her seem almost untouchable. Those who met her in social settings remarked on her poise, unaware of the storm she harbored beneath the surface. One evening, David returned home later than usual, flushed with pride over a supposedly important client meeting. Emily greeted him warmly, her voice soft and inviting. "Dinner's ready," she said, her tone perfectly normal, betraying nothing. He smiled, leaning down to kiss her cheek. "Thanks, hon, I'm starving." They ate in silence, but Emily was alert, noting every gesture, every expression. When he left the room to take a call, she retrieved her phone and checked the anonymous accounts she had created. New responses had arrived, clients asking questions, colleagues expressing concern. Her pulse quickened. The network she had built was expanding, moving faster than even she had anticipated. The next step required subtle manipulation. Emily began planting small seeds of doubt in David's mind. She left traces of her investigative work strategically visible, just enough to make him question his assumptions. A photo left carelessly on the coffee table, an open tab on her laptop, a half-finished note that he glimpsed as he passed by. It was psychological warfare, quiet and effective. Eroding his confidence without direct confrontation, David began to notice minor inconsistencies, mails he hadn't sent, phone calls that were answered by unknown voices, whispers in his professional network he couldn't trace. He started pacing in the apartment, muttering to himself, his normally confident demeanor fraying at the edges. Emily watched silently, letting the fear build, savoring the way he stumbled over each imagined misstep. One night, during a business dinner Emily had agreed to attend, she saw an opportunity to accelerate her plan. David was laughing too loudly, boasting about a deal that was not entirely secure. Emily kept her calm, sipping her wine, observing the room with practiced detachment. Across the table, she noticed subtle signs of tension among David's clients, small expressions of doubt that he failed to see. She knew that soon, the truth would catch up to him, and he would have no one to blame but himself. Returning home, Emily continued her silent work. She documented his behavior meticulously, taking notes on his comings and goings, his lies, and his interactions with the woman in the crimson coat. Each page in her journal was a record, a testimony that would later serve her not just in court, but in the personal vindication she sought. She wasn't acting out of spite alone. She was reclaiming the power he had stolen from her, piece by piece. Weeks turned into months. David's confidence waned. He grew increasingly paranoid, questioning employees, friends, and acquaintances. Trying to uncover the source of the growing unease surrounding him, Emily maintained her facade flawlessly. She remained the supportive, loving wife, hiding the predator she had become behind a veneer of domestic normality. Then came the moment of confrontation, not with anger, not with shouting, but with undeniable evidence. Emily had collected photographs, recordings, and documents that mapped out David's duplicity in detail. She organized them meticulously, creating a folder that even a novice could understand. Every interaction, every infidelity, every lie was cataloged. She was ready. One evening, she invited David into the living room. She sat across from him, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "David, we need to talk," she said, her voice steady, her expression serene. He looked at her, irritation flickering. "About what?" She slid the folder across the coffee table. His eyes widened as he flipped it open, scanning the contents. The photos, the receipts, the anonymous emails, the careful logs, it was all there. He tried to speak, to deny, to justify, but Emily held his gaze, unyielding. "This isn't about accusations," she said softly, but with steel beneath the surface. "This is about truth. This is about us, and this is about what you've done, and how it has affected me." David stumbled, words failing him. Emily continued, explaining every betrayal, every absence, every lie. She watched him shrink beneath the weight of undeniable evidence. Felt a sense of satisfaction that was more profound than vengeance. It was the justice she had meticulously carved out. By the time the conversation ended, David was silent, broken, and fully aware that his arrogance had blinded him to the woman beside him, the woman who had loved him, endeared him, and finally decided that enough was enough. Emily leaned back, exhausted but triumphant. The storm she had nurtured quietly had reached its crescendo. She was no longer the vulnerable wife. She was the orchestrator of her own destiny. and as David retreated to the bedroom, silent and defeated, Emily realized that this was just the beginning not of her revenge, but of her freedom. Emily woke the next morning, feeling a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The confrontation with David had left a lingering tension in the apartment, but for the first time in months, she felt a sense of control. She moved through her morning routine methodically, each step deliberate, every movement a statement of regained power. Her reflection in the mirror no longer showed the fragile, heartbroken woman who had once cried herself to sleep. It was a woman who had endured, planned, and emerged victorious. Even if the battle was only partially over, David remained distant, avoiding her gaze during breakfast. He muttered perfunctory words, his voice tinged with unease. Emily observed him quietly, noting every twitch of his expression, every subtle gesture betraying his inner turmoil. It pleased her, the knowledge that his arrogance had been dismantled not with anger, but with calculated patience and undeniable evidence. Weeks passed, and Emily carefully orchestrated the next phase of her plan. She had realized that to ensure her freedom and final victory, she had to solidify her position professionally and socially. She attended meetings with a renewed confidence, commanding respect in ways that had previously eluded her. Her colleagues noticed the shift, her presence now demanding attention. Her opinions weighted with authority. At home, Emily maintained the facade of normalcy, though David's world was quietly unraveling. He had become cautious, suspicious, and irritable, constantly looking over his shoulder, second-guessing interactions that once seemed trivial. Emily allowed him to flounder, observing silently. The silent predator watching her prey stumbled through the maze she had built. One evening, she invited a few close colleagues to the apartment for a casual dinner, carefully curated to appear innocuous. The conversation flowed, laughter filling the space, and David, initially oblivious, gradually sensed a subtle shift in dynamics. He noticed how Emily's colleagues looked at her not with pity or condescension, but with respect, admiration, and perhaps a touch of envy. Emily seized the moment. She spoke with poised authority, discussing projects and ideas that subtly highlighted her competence, indirectly emphasizing David's shortcomings without direct confrontation. His pride was bruised, but he dared not challenge her in front of others. By the time the evening ended, David was quiet, a shadow of his former confident self. Privately, Emily had begun planning her ultimate separation. She consulted discreetly with lawyers, ensuring that every document, every financial transaction, every record of David's indiscretions would protect her and leave him with no room to maneuver. It was meticulous work, but Emily thrived in the details. Each step brought her closer to the freedom and vindication she sought. Her personal transformation continued as well. Emily had taken up new routines that reinforced her sense of strength and independence. Early morning runs through Central Park gave her clarity and focus. Meditation and journaling sharpened her mind and honed her strategic thinking. She was becoming not just a survivor, but a force to be reckoned with. Meanwhile, David attempted to regain some semblance of control. He tried to charm her, to remind her of the man she had once loved, but Emily met every effort with calm, measured detachment. She didn't retaliate with anger. She simply observed, calculating, waiting. Each attempt he made only reinforced her certainty that his manipulations were powerless against her newfound resolve. The next critical moment arrived unexpectedly. David, desperate to salvage his reputation at work and perhaps at home, invited Emily to a high-profile corporate gala, insisting they present a united front. Emily agreed, seeing the opportunity not just as a social event, but as a stage where she could subtly assert her dominance. At the gala, Emily was the picture of poise and elegance. Her dress, her demeanor, the confidence in her step all drew attention. David, initially proud, soon realized that the eyes that followed her were not just admiring, but assessing, respecting, and perhaps fearing her quiet authority. Throughout the evening, she engaged with colleagues, clients, and influential figures with strategic grace, planting seeds of influence that would serve her in the coming days. David's mistress, aware of Emily's presence, tried to approach him discreetly, but Emily intercepted with impeccable timing. Her smile was polite, but her words were sharp and deliberate. She didn't accuse, she didn't confront directly, but she conveyed, with subtlety, that she knew everything. The woman recoiled, a hint of panic in her eyes, and Emily allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. It was a silent victory, a psychological checkmate that left her opponent uncertain and fearful. Back at home, Emily began consolidating her next moves. She gathered all the financial records, communications, and evidence she had collected, organizing them with precision. Each folder, each file, was labeled and cross-referenced. She was preparing not just for the end of the marriage, but for a controlled, decisive conclusion that would leave David exposed and powerless. David, sensing the mounting pressure, became erratic. His attempts at reconciliation were clumsy, his apologies insincere, and his demeanor increasingly desperate. Emily, however, met him with unshakable calm. She listened to his pleas, nodded politely, and maintained a facade of consideration, all while internally plotting the final stage of her plan. Emily also took steps to protect herself emotionally. She sought therapy discreetly, strengthening her mental resilience and learning to detach from the lingering pain of betrayal. She immersed herself in her work, her passions, and her social network, ensuring that when the time came to sever ties completely, she would be unshakable, independent, and fully prepared. Months of meticulous planning culminated in a moment that was both inevitable and perfectly timed. Emily requested a private meeting with David, presenting her case with calm authority. She laid out the evidence, the implications, and the steps she intended to take. Her voice was steady, her eyes unwavering. David, for the first time, was rendered speechless, confronted not with anger or accusation, but with undeniable truth and strategic precision. Emily's words were deliberate, each one a carefully measured strike. She outlined the consequences of his actions, the legal ramifications, and her expectations for the dissolution of their relationship. There was no room for negotiation, no possibility of evasion. David's attempts to interject were met with quiet, unwavering control. By the end of the meeting, Emily had achieved what she had meticulously planned. She was no longer the heartbroken, betrayed wife. She was a strategist, a survivor, a woman who had turned pain into power, betrayal into opportunity, and heartbreak into a carefully orchestrated victory. As she walked away from the meeting, Emily felt a profound sense of liberation. The storm had passed, leaving clarity, control, and empowerment in its wake. She understood that revenge, when executed with precision and patience, was not about cruelty. It was about reclaiming one's life, asserting one's worth, and ensuring that justice, however delayed, was inevitably served. The morning after the decisive meeting, Emily awoke with a sense of calm she hadn't known in years. The apartment was quiet, the city outside bustling, as always, indifferent to the personal battles fought within its walls. She moved through her morning routine, methodically, a serene clarity guiding each action. There was no anger now, no simmering tension, only focus and purpose. The woman who had cried, doubted, and endured had finally stepped fully into her own power. David, however, was a shadow of the man he had once been. His arrogance, once unshakable, had crumbled under the weight of Emily's carefully executed plan. Rumors at work, subtle public exposures, and undeniable evidence had left him isolated, discredited, and haunted by the realization that the life he had taken for granted was no longer his to command. Every move he made now was cautious, every word measured, and every glance over his shoulder reminded him of the woman who had orchestrated his downfall. Emily began the final phase of her plan, not just for her own liberation, but to assert, definitively, that she would no longer be undermined or overlooked. She met with the divorce attorney once more, finalizing documents that ensured she retained full financial security, custody of personal assets, and a public reputation untarnished. The process was meticulous, each signature and notarization a step toward total independence. Yet Emily's focus was not solely legal. She was determined to reclaim her emotional and psychological space. She took long walks through the city, revisiting the streets she and David had once walked hand in hand. Now seeing them with fresh eyes, she dined alone in the restaurants they had frequented together, savoring the meals and the solitude. She traveled to the parks, museums, and quiet cafes, relishing the freedom to exist fully as herself, without pretense, without compromise. David, sensing the inevitability of the divorce, made a final, desperate attempt at reconciliation. He arrived at her apartment unannounced one evening, his posture tense, his eyes searching for a reaction. "Emily," he began, voice tight, "please, can we talk?" She met his gaze calmly, a faint, controlled smile playing on her lips. "We've talked, David. More than enough." His frustration bubbled beneath the surface. "I can fix this. We can make it right." Emily shook her head slowly. "No, David, you don't get to decide what's right anymore. You've chosen your path, and now I choose mine." For the first time, he was truly silent. Emily watched as the reality of his defeat sank in. She didn't gloat, didn't insult. Her triumph lay in her composure, her clarity, and her unwavering control. Over the following weeks, the divorce finalized, Emily's life transformed. She moved into a new apartment, a space that reflected her independence and taste. She decorated it herself, curated it carefully, each piece a statement of her reclaimed identity. Friends noticed the change immediately. Emily was no longer quiet or withdrawn. She was confident, radiant, and unshakable, a woman whose past struggles had forged a remarkable strength. She returned to work with renewed energy, spearheading major projects, mentoring younger colleagues, and asserting herself in ways that were once unimaginable. Professional success became a natural extension of the control and agency she had gained in her personal life. Emily's personal life flourished as well. She explored friendships, traveled independently, and began to open her heart slowly, cautiously, to the idea of new love, but this time on her terms. with someone who respected and valued her fully. She had learned the value of boundaries, self-respect, and emotional intelligence, lessons forged in the fires of betrayal and vindication. One evening, as she walked along the quiet streets near her apartment, Emily reflected on the journey she had endured. She remembered the pain, the sleepless nights, the silent cries into pillows, the fear, and the heartbreak. And yet, she also remembered the growth, the meticulous planning, the strategic thinking, and ultimately, the triumph. Each memory was a testament to her resilience, her intellect, and her unyielding spirit. She paused to look at the skyline of the city. Lights glittering like stars reflected on glass and steel. A soft smile touched her lips. She had faced betrayal, orchestrated her revenge with precision, and emerged not just intact, but transformed. She was no longer defined by her past or by the mistakes of another. She was defined by her strength, her clarity, and the life she would continue to build on her own terms. Emily understood now that true revenge had not been cruelty, had been reclamation. It had been taking back what was rightfully hers, her dignity, her autonomy, her peace of mind. And in doing so, she had also discovered something she hadn't expected: liberation, freedom from fear, from manipulation, from the shadow of someone else's deceit. The apartment was quiet. The city hummed, and Emily, standing tall and steady, felt the full measure of her victory. She had endured, she had planned, she had executed, and now she was whole. As she returned to her apartment, the door closing softly behind her, Emily felt the final weight lift from her shoulders. She had written the last chapter of her past, and the pages ahead were hers alone to fill. She was no longer a victim, no longer constrained by deceit or betrayal. She was a strategist, a survivor, and above all, a woman free to live fully, boldly, and on her own terms. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Emily smiled, not the tentative, hopeful smile of the past, but a confident, enduring smile. The smile of a woman who had faced the storm, emerged victorious, and would never again be diminished by anyone's betrayal. The future stretched ahead, limitless and bright, and Emily stepped into it with unshakable confidence, ready for whatever life would bring, because she had discovered the ultimate truth. Power, peace, and freedom were hers, and no one could ever take them away.